Hello everyone, Kurt Holford here, and welcome back to another episode from Holford Labs. Today we're going to be looking at the counter to the play that we did last week, which deals with the low line thrust that we saw from a sword against somebody who's using a dagger to defend themselves. So in this case right here, it ultimately deals with structures in which Fury has already spelled out to us throughout the rest of the manual in the very beginning into the present portion right here, which deals with how mechanics and everything else might work together, as well as starts to give us indication about how, if someone makes a mistake, how we can capitalize on it. And personally, I think that's a very cool part about this right here, is because we're starting to see how person senyo mentality potentially has a place right here that we might be able to target. And it speaks into kind of a concept right here that shows the tactical approach. So before I go too far into this, let's get into it.
So welcome back to another segment of the dagger against the sword. This week we're going to be talking about the countering action right here that deals with the sword in the low line thrust area here. A big part about this here that is very important to understand is that you're already starting to see here from this lessons from dagger carrying over, because we start seeing cross-arm concepts and how we can close and shut those things down. So remember the image shows us this. In the original play that we talked about here, what looks like right here is where it comes down to key factors and placement. He comes in, I shoot, and he comes across right here to the elbow, and that's where we're at. This right here is a key aspect of what we're doing here. And we're going to swap roles here today, because the reality is I want him to grab my sleeve, which is essentially what I think Fury wants us to do. When we look at gi fighting and jiu-jitsu, grabbing onto stuff right here is a big part of what would make sense, especially in a historical context, when an outfit like this might be more likely to be the thing that you have than, dockers and yeah, exactly. So we get a little bit of modernism right here. It's good. So we'll swap arms here. We're going to go to the other side. The big thing about this right here is, again, in this space, I come right here, I shoot off this way. Now, if he grabs me like this right here, I am in trouble. The moment I let go of this right here, and I come up with this, the dagger's already in place, and he can push and turn me right here. This week, however, we're going to do the same thing. The reason that made that possible is because he grabbed my right arm to turn my body. Even if I fight against it, that's the part about this, even if I fight against it. That's the thing about the sword. At range, it's got very nasty things right here, if you're just talking about the edge. But if I come in straight with this right here, and he grabs my arm, as soon as he pops up with this, yes, I can turn, I can't do much more with this. Even if I nick him, the kinetic force of the sword striking against somebody is lessened in comparison. Remember, not a lightsaber. And if you want to see more on that, take a look at the video I've linked in the description right here, which I call Sword Caliber, in regards to effective striking on swords and whatnot. Here, it might really suck. But for historical clothing, it may be more of a blow than it would have been a cut. So those are big things to consider about. The counter to this, as we can see in the image, looks like this. As I shoot and thrust here, now, in this case, he makes a fatal mistake. He has his hand here ready with it all, but he hasn't done anything with it grabbing onto the arm. So what Fury tells us to do is he grabs up this way, he's going to pop over and step across. And now we're in a position where I have the sword up in place. If he has a low sleeve here, grab the elbow, grab anything in this space, okay? Again, it's rotational. What is his volta stabile? In, thrust. His volta stabile is rotating this way. So in this case, I grab a cross body, so I'm effectively making a concept of second master. Into this right here, and I'm going to use all my body weight to turn him and be able to present. Why? What does a mezza volta get us? Well, one, a couple of things. So for this position, if I just go across and do this, one, if he wants to resist this, we're now in a spot of who is bigger and stronger, because we are in, and this will be something later on we talk more about in the sword, we are now in a mirrored posture. With his left foot forward and my right foot forward here, he can break me over quite easily, because at this point in time here, it's a matter of where my arm is going to go. We have a point right here that comes down the line. Even with his hand, I don't have the leverage. And by the hand, he can retract this, which also, by the way, does the same thing. And those are key factors that come to this. So instead, grab and push up and over. Now, I'm going to demonstrate that here. So coming in here, grab me across, just go with me. I don't want to grab your skin. I'm going to pull this up and over. One thing we talked about before is like make them eat their arm, which pulls them into this, and now I can step into this, right? In this case right here, my arm's extended. If he tries to turn back around at me, he can't. I have a sword right into his side right here. If he decides to come back down with a revezzo, which could be a possibility, I have all this time right here to work against him. I have a pommel, I've got an edge, I've got all sorts of plays right there that I can work against to cover against that revezzo spot. And that actually might be something that's actually quite interesting with this. In, here, turn, he goes to revezzo. Now, I can use the sword in a third master concept to really mess up his day. With his back exposed to me on this, this is where falling back to what was already taught within the sword section, within the dagger section, really comes into play. And it's very nice. Because at that point right here, this is my hand. I'm not going to throw my sword away here to make the third master. I'm going to use this right here as a hand, and I can bite this into his hand here, I can wrap across, and I can create the same kind of concepts right there to do different types of things. So again, the big part about this again here, the theory of the image. I see him, I got him, I'm going to thrust in here, I turn, as I step across, I'm into this, right? So his back is towards me, he doesn't like this. Right here, I have all sorts of things I can do against him. I can strike the areas, I can hit his flanks like he taught us to do, I can put this into his jaw, I can cut his throat, I can strike the back of his head, I can cut on his arm, I can do all sorts of things, I can cut his leg, there's all sorts of things that can happen here from this position. If I turn him and he starts to reverse on me, then I have to address this, because here comes the revezzo shot, which many men have died by, and from here, my blade is now something here that goes into this, which allows me to get across, or in my case, I might even actually strip it off his arm this way with a turn of the sword. Those are all different concepts at play later on. And believe you me, in sparring, we've tried it, and it works. It's crazy. So please understand that when we're talking about these things right here, we're not pressure testing, we're trying to get into the mind of a situation. This is a theory right here. The big thing that is the takeaway is as someone is coming in with this right here, I see this, I can reach across, and we're making this kind of cross-by thing, which allows us to turn and to get that sword. The thing that's important here, the tip, not the cut, the tip. The tip itself is the point that we're caring about here. And that concludes what we have here as far as contending with what he shows as a counter mechanism right here to the sword, to the dagger, who is coming across that way.
So you can see with the video here, again, when this play, when I was doing the video footage, and again, it's link to that video is in this as well. Whenever I would parry off with the dagger against a thrust of the sword, it grated along in certain areas because you could catch the edge in certain portions, and the dagger was displaced the sword in a way that allowed for certain grappling positions. It has been my experience when it comes down to plays like this, where when you start talking about using edges against each other, that's essentially no different than grabbing on somebody with hands, but now you have sharp objects and devices that allow for things to be able to be manipulated in different forms and fashion. All that to say is that essentially this play right here, where we are essentially going into what I think is later on what Fiore's exchange of thrust, which is to use an offline position to get to a center line vector on somebody, we're looking at that as a way of being able to displace. Now, in this right here, we're countering that. And because we're countering it right here, we have to look at the fact that why does somebody get to the point where the elbow of that person doing the dagger is available to them? There's a couple of things I think that are very important about this right here is that essentially in training, I don't know if anyone else has experienced this, but for me, sometimes in training, I'm like, oh, wow, the technique worked. And then someone grabs me because I'm so focused on the initial portion working that I forget to keep continuing on with the rest of the play. My awareness goes to this one moment where, hey, it worked, and then from there, I get capitalized on. Not an uncommon thing right there, and honestly, I think that's even more of a case when it becomes down to a life and death scenario, because the person that's doing this type of thing right here, their mentality is thinking about keeping the sword away as much as possible. And that is a part right there that is very difficult to contend with here, especially with your mind in a fight scenario. A big part about this right here that I think is very important is to understand that as the blade shifts off into this portion right here, again, someone may have been trying just to get the blade out of the way and shove over. And again, as you can see right here, just by trying to simulate going over like this right here to get the sword away from me, my elbow presents itself. Sometimes we get surprised and sometimes we get attacked and when it comes into training, and sometimes we're not expecting any of that. And because we don't expect any of those types of things right there, there becomes this notion that essentially I have to contend in a different form of fashion right here that allows me to put the blade off and contend with the arm. But when that happens, we open ourselves up to things. Now, this to me gives me insight to how and why certain plays become a functionality here. And before I go too far into this, I want to invoke actually a portion of the Zettel from the Lichtenauer tradition, which states that no man defends himself without danger. To me, that's an important piece about when you look at characters in these types of plays. Essentially, when we look at this, we have to consider that the person that's doing this knows what they're doing. So just because, like, when I was starting out with this right here years ago, you have one guy that's getting beaten by the other guy. That initially I was like, I don't want to be that guy. But then I came to a point where I don't want to be that guy either. So who's the guy that what's the guy I want to be here? The reason why I say I don't want to be either one of those guys right there is because essentially they are in a very kinetic situation and both of them know what they're doing. The very reason why the person performed a parry with a dagger or parry with a sword or a grapple is because it was a valid threat. That person had to defend themselves because there was danger. If there was no danger, then they would never have protected themselves. I say this right here is because ultimately when you look at the manuscript of Fiore, there's also things within this right here that I think also give us even more context when it comes down to fighting and whatnot, is because essentially, even though you have the basics of what he teaches right there, somebody might throw something in here that's a little bit different that causes for an outcome to come about this. I think that's a very interesting piece here because at the end of the day here, the guy who performed with the dagger performed an action against the person with the sword, who was initially, in the previous one, the guy just performing a thrust. But the guy going with the thrust, it was a credible threat, and therefore the person with the dagger had to shift and move. That is a big part about what makes me think that Fiore's manuscript is, again, about lethal encounter, is because you see these plays and images right here, that they talk about each other. You have remedies, you have masters, that almost seem to become circular with one another here, that basically convey the message that if you get yourself into the situation, your awareness of what is happening and your understanding of yourself as well as the art are two major components. Not to mention also the length that you have against somebody, so whether it be grappling, dagger, or sword, and then later on axe, lance, and horse. These are all different things right here that you have to be aware of, which at the end goes back to Fiore's first portion of when you look at somebody, assess their strengths, weaknesses, etc., your strengths and weaknesses, do they take up the position of adversary, etc. And that right there allows us to understand what kind of actions we may have to contend with. So right now I'm talking a lot about the theory right here, which may not sound like a lot of, essentially like, why are we not talking about the technique? But the video stands for itself. It's very easy to come across with this right here. And again, when you make a covering space right here, that person's mentality is not necessarily thinking, oh, well, here's something very nice. Well, that worked here. I can do this right here. This person may be thinking, I don't want to die. And now I just set myself up because the person wasn't in that space. So that might be able to give some insight, again, to you, dear viewers, that perhaps when Fiore makes these kind of comments within the manuscript, he's not insulting anybody. He's just calling it as what happens, what's natural in any type of sparring or fight situation. Two people of equal caliber and skill can make mistakes. And that's the big thing about all fighting is make the person make a mistake and then make them pay for it. So that's going to conclude this video right here. Again, I think that these plays, especially when it comes to counters and whatnot, this counter right here, you'll see it again in other forms and whatnot, because essentially it's not just a one and done concept. As always, Fiore seems to aim always for the elbow, which makes a lot of sense. He attacks the anatomy of a person's structure, which also makes a lot of sense. He either breaks it or he uses the strength against it. He uses the strength of it to create openings for himself. And those right there talk about a huge part about why, perhaps, when he says if he had done 40 years of medicine, he would have been a doctor. Again, my theory on that is that he understands structures and bodies, so he can actually make those things happen. So that's going to conclude for this video right here. Thank you so much for stopping by. Again, if you're new to the channel, hit the bell, hit the like, the subscribe. Please leave a comment below. We'd love to hear what you have to say out there. And share this with a friend out there because we're trying to grow this channel as much as we possibly can. If you are one of my viewers and subscribers, thank you so much as always for tuning in. I really appreciate it. As always, share with a friend out there because again, we want this idea of what Armatsari is to grow and expand, and that's not possible without viewers like you and those that might be interested in it. So take care, everybody, and as always, please stay safe out there, train well, and fight on. I'll see you all soon.